Hey everyone, welcome back to more Reddit HOA stories. In this fresh tale, I did the HOA a massive favor, only for them to take advantage of my generosity. I rented them my land at a ridiculously low rate so they could construct a pool. But years down the line, the new HOA president decided I didn't belong there and had me banned while her kid tried to toss me out like I was some unwanted animal. So I stopped playing nice. Let's get right into it. The title of this story is, Am I the A-hole for getting revenge on an HOA Karen spoiled kid and destroying the HOA's pool experience? A bit of background first. I'm based in the Philippines, and I inherited a substantial piece of land from my Lolo grandfather when he passed away several years ago. It's not like I'm wealthy or anything, but my grandfather was financially savvy and purchased land in our province back when prices were incredibly low. Most of the land is agricultural, some coconut farms and rice paddies that I rent out to local farmers. But there are also a few residential lots, and what has grown into a fairly developed subdivision area. The subdivision in question expanded around one of the lots I own. Essentially, what happened was a developer purchased a large tract of land surrounding my Lolo's property decades ago and constructed a gated community. My grandpa refused to sell because he was stubborn. I apparently inherited that trait. So his lot ended up as this odd little island sitting in the middle of an otherwise uniform subdivision. A few years back, the HOA of this subdivision came to me because they wanted to build a community pool and recreational area. The issue was that every lot within the subdivision was either already developed or allocated, and the only space large enough for what they had in mind was my lot. They asked whether I'd consider selling. Now, I could have sold it and walked away with decent money, but my grandpa always told me never to sell land. They're not making any more of it, he used to say. So I told him I wouldn't sell, but I was open to long-term lease. We negotiated and arrived at a genuinely great deal for them, honestly. I gave him a 10-year lease for next to nothing, seriously, well below market rate. My thinking was that having a nice pool and recreational facility there would boost the value of my property anyway, and I liked the idea of the community benefiting from it. The lease agreement was straightforward. They could build whatever recreational facilities they wanted. They would maintain the property, cover the real estate taxes, and pay me a nominal lease amount each year. I retained the right to use the facilities as part of the deal since, it is my land. The lease also contained standard termination clauses, including one that allowed either party to terminate with 90 days notice for material breach of terms. For the first few years, everything went smoothly. The HOA built a really nice pool, a small clubhouse, some covered picnic areas, and a little playground. I'd visit maybe once or twice a month, usually on weekday mornings when it wasn't crowded. The residents were friendly, the guards recognized me, and everything was relaxed. But then about 2 years ago, a new family moved into the HOA subdivision. The mom immediately inserted herself into the HOA and within roughly 6 months had somehow worked her way into the position of HOA president. I'll call her Karen because, she earned that label multiple times over. The first time I crossed paths with Karen was at an HOA meeting I attended. I got invited to these meetings as a stakeholder. Even though I wasn't technically an HOA member since I didn't live there, I mostly skipped them because they were boring. But this particular meeting was about potentially expanding the recreational facilities, and I wanted to hear what they were planning since it was my land. Karen had apparently not been filled in on who I was or the history of the property. About 10 minutes into the meeting, she interrupted someone speaking about landscaping costs to point at me and ask who I was and why I was there. The former HOA president, a pleasant older man named Tony, attempted to explain that I was the landowner, but Karen quickly cut him off and said something about how non-members shouldn't be present at member meetings. Tony looked embarrassed and tried again to clarify, but Karen had already moved on to the next agenda item. After the meeting, Tony pulled me aside and apologized. He explained that Karen had basically steamrolled everyone into handing her the presidency and that she was very particular about rules and procedures. I told him it was fine, no big deal. I didn't really care about attending the meetings anyway. He looked relieved, but also a little troubled, as if he sensed things were going to get worse. And they did get worse. Over the following year, Karen introduced a whole bunch of new rules for the pool and recreational area. Some were reasonable, like requiring a shower before swimming and prohibiting glass containers on the pool deck, but others were clearly designed to make the facilities more exclusive. She put in place a guest policy requiring HOA members to register any visitors 48 hours in advance and capped each household at 4 guest visits per month. She also pushed through a rule that all pool users had to present their HOA membership card to the guard before entering. The first time I showed up after these new rules were in effect, the guard stopped me and asked for my membership card. I explained that I wasn't a member, but that I was the landowner and held access rights under the lease agreement. The poor security guard looked bewildered and called his supervisor, who also looked confused. Eventually they let me in, but said they need to verify with the HOA office. A few days later, I received a letter from the HOA signed by Karen informing me that my prior arrangement for facility access was under review and that I should hold off on using the facilities until the matter was resolved by the board. I thought this was absurd since my access rights were literally written into the lease agreement. So I disregarded the letter and kept visiting the pool as usual. The second time I showed up after receiving that letter, Karen was there too. She marched straight over to me while I was settling my things onto a lounge chair and demanded to know who I was and how I'd gotten in. I recognized her from the meeting and calmly tried to explain the situation. I told her I was the landowner and that my access rights were part of the lease agreement and that I'd been using the facilities for years without any issues. But she didn't take this well. She told me she had looked into my claims and that there was no record of any landowner having special access privileges. She said the facilities were for HOA members only, and that if I wasn't a member, I needed to leave. I told her she should review the lease agreement more carefully, and she claimed she had reviewed it and found nothing about landowner access. Now, I knew for a fact that was incorrect because I had drafted the agreement and my lawyer had reviewed it. Article 7, Section 3 specifically stated that the lessor, meaning me, retained the right to reasonable personal use of any facilities constructed on the leased property. It was not ambiguous in any way. But I didn't have a copy on me, and Karen clearly wasn't interested in a reasonable conversation. So I just said I'd have my lawyer send over a copy and then left. My lawyer sent a certified letter to the HOA with a highlighted copy of the relevant lease provisions. I assumed that would settle the matter. It did not. Karen responded with her own letter claiming that the lease provisions only applied to the original lessor and that since my grandfather was deceased, the access rights didn't transfer to me as the heir. This was completely nonsensical legal reasoning, but Karen appeared to genuinely believe it. She also argued that even if the access rights did transfer, they were subject to reasonable regulation by the HOA and that requiring me to register as a guest 48 hours in advance was a so-called reasonable regulation. My lawyer sent another letter laying out basic property law and pointing out that lease rights absolutely do transfer to heirs and that requiring the landowner to register as a guest to access his own property was by definition unreasonable. Karen responded by stating the matter was now with the HOA's legal counsel and that I should refrain from using the facilities until everything was resolved. At this point, I was annoyed, but not truly angry. I had plenty of other things going on, and the pool wasn't that important to me. I figured I'd let the lawyers handle it, and that eventually Karen would have to back down since she was clearly wrong on the law. But then I encountered Karen's son. I decided to head to the pool one Saturday afternoon because it was hot and I was tired of waiting for lawyers to trade letters. When I reached the guard, I showed him a copy of the lease agreement with the relevant section highlighted and explained that this gave me access rights regardless of what Karen had said. The guard was visibly uncomfortable, but he let me in. I think he was fed up with being stuck in the middle of this ridiculous dispute. The pool area was pretty packed since it was a weekend, and I found an empty lounge chair in a corner and was getting settled when I noticed a group of teenagers near the pool making a lot of noise. One of them in particular was acting like he owned the place, splashing people who clearly didn't want to be splashed and generally being obnoxious. He looked to be around 16 or 17. I ignored them and went to take a dip in the pool. I was doing laps when the obnoxious kid decided to cannonball right next to me, completely drenching me and throwing off my rhythm. I shot him a look but didn't say anything. I mean, I wasn't going to pick a fight with a teenager over a cannonball. But then he did it again and again. The third time, he came up laughing and said something like, "Old man can't swim," to his friends. I'm not old. I'm in my 30s, but whatever. I decided to get out of the pool and just relax on the lounge chair instead. I dried off and settled in with a book I brought. About 20 minutes later, the same group of teenagers came over to where I was sitting, and the obnoxious kid looked at me and said I was in his spot. I looked around, and there were no reserved signs, no towels or belongings marking the chair. Nothing to suggest this was anyone's spot. I politely told him I didn't see any reservation and that I'd been there for a while. But that's when things escalated. The kid got really aggressive and said that this was his mom's pool and he could sit wherever he wanted. He told me to move, and I asked him who his mom was. He said his mom was the HOA president and she ran the place. Ah, caranaison. Of course. I told him that his mom didn't actually own the pool or the land it was built on, and that I had just as much right to be there as anyone else. Probably more, actually. But I kept that part to myself. He laughed and said, "You're not even a member. I saw you arguing with my mom last month. She told me about you. You're the guy who keeps trying to sneak in, huh?" Then he said, and I remember this clearly because it was so absurd, "I'm banning you from this pool. You're not allowed here anymore. Get out before I call security." A 16-year-old was trying to ban me from my own property. I didn't know whether to laugh or be impressed by the sheer audacity. I told him he couldn't ban me because his mom didn't own the land and neither did the HOA. They were just renting it. He said I was lying and that his mom told him the HOA owned everything. I said his mom was wrong. He said his mom was never wrong and that I needed to leave right now before he made me leave. At this point, several other adults around the pool were watching. None of them stepped in, which I found interesting. Either they agreed with the kid or they were too afraid of Karen to say anything. The kid then actually called security. The security guard came over looking extremely uncomfortable, and the kid demanded the guard remove this trespasser. The guard looked at me apologetically and said that according to his instructions from management, I wasn't supposed to be using the facilities. I told him I understood his position, but that I wasn't going to leave since I had legal access rights. The kid started yelling about how I was trespassing and how his mom was going to sue me. Then he pulled out his phone and called Karen. Karen showed up about 15 minutes later, storming into the pool area and making a beeline for where I was still sitting on the lounge chair. The kid stood nearby with his arms crossed, looking smug. Karen told me she had warned me multiple times not to use the facilities until the so-called legal dispute was resolved. She said my presence was causing a disturbance and that I needed to leave immediately. I told her there was no legal dispute. The lease was clear, and she was simply refusing to accept what it said. She said she was calling the police to have me removed for trespassing. I told her she was welcome to call the police, but that they'd tell her exactly what I was telling her. You can't trespass on your own property. She actually did call the police. While we waited for them to arrive, her son kept making comments about how I was going to be arrested and how he couldn't wait to see me in handcuffs. Some of the other pool users quietly gathered their belongings and left. The atmosphere was genuinely uncomfortable. The police arrived about 30 minutes later. 2 officers came in, and Karen immediately launched into how I was trespassing, harassing her family, and refusing to leave. The officers asked for my side of the story, and I calmly explained the situation, showing them a copy of the lease agreement and the relevant provisions about my access rights. The officers reviewed the documents, exchanged a glance, and then one of them told Karen that this appeared to be a civil matter rather than a criminal one. He said that based on the documentation I provided, I appear to have a legitimate claim to be on the property and that they couldn't remove me for trespassing. He suggested Karen consult with a lawyer and resolve the dispute through proper legal channels. Karen was furious. She began arguing with the officers, insisting they weren't doing their jobs and that I was clearly a trespasser. One of the officers told her firmly that unless she had evidence the documentation I provided was fraudulent, there was nothing they could do. She demanded their badge numbers and said she was going to file a complaint. They handed over their badge numbers without any visible reaction and left. After the police departed, Karen turned to me and said something I'll never forget. "This is not over. I'll make sure you never set foot on this property again. I don't care what your papers say. This is my community, and you don't belong here." As she grabbed her son and left. I stayed for another hour just on principle, but I wasn't enjoying myself anymore. The whole thing had ruined my afternoon. Over the following weeks, things deteriorated further. Someone started a rumor throughout the subdivision that I was some kind of con artist trying to claim ownership of HOA property. I started receiving hostile stares from residents whenever I showed up at the pool. A few times, people would pointedly get up and relocate to different areas when I sat down nearby. The guards who used to greet me warmly now barely acknowledged me. Karen also apparently launched a campaign to have the lease agreement reviewed for so-called irregularities. She sent me a formal letter demanding certified copies of my grandfather's will, the title transfer documentation, and proof of my identity. My lawyer said this was pure harassment and that we weren't obligated to provide anything beyond what we'd already submitted. But he advised me to comply anyway just to put the matter to rest. So we sent her everything she requested. A few weeks later, she sent another letter claiming that one of the signatures on the original lease looked suspicious and demanded a forensic analysis. At this point, my lawyer said we should consider our options for dealing with the harassment. But the final straw for me wasn't Karen. It was her son. I showed up at the pool one morning on a weekday, figuring it'd be quiet and I could swim in peace. It was mostly empty, just a few older folks doing their morning exercises in the shallow end. I was doing laps when I noticed Karen's son arrive with a group of friends once again. School must have been on break or something. They spotted me in the pool and huddled together talking. Then they got in and started doing exactly what they'd done before. Cannonballs right next to me, splashing, generally making it impossible to swim. When I tried to move to a different part of the pool, they followed me. Then the kids said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Hey guys, this is the crazy guy who thinks he owns this place. My mom says he's probably mentally ill and we should feel sorry for him." His friends laughed, and one of them said, "I look like a squatter." Another made a comment about how I probably couldn't afford my own pool. So I got out of the water without saying a word, but I was done. Not done with swimming, done with the entire situation. That afternoon, I called my lawyer and told him to draft a termination notice for the lease. He asked if I was certain, pointing out that I'd be giving up the minimal income and that it might be difficult to find another tenant for that specific property. I told him I didn't care about the income. I wanted them off my land. My lawyer noted that under Philippine law and the terms of the lease, I need grounds for early termination or would have to wait until the lease expired. We reviewed the lease together and found what we needed. Article 2. Section 2 required the lessee to maintain respectful relations with the lessor and refrain from any actions that could be construed as harassment, defamation, or interference with the lessor's rights under the agreement. Karen had violated this section repeatedly through the false claims about my access rights, the accusations to the police, the demand for forensic signature analysis, and the rumor campaign throughout the subdivision. My lawyer said we had more than sufficient grounds for termination based on material breach. So we sent the termination notice. Under the terms of the lease, the HOA had 90 days to vacate the property and remove any structures they wished to keep. Anything left behind after 90 days would become my property. The response was immediate and explosive. Karen sent a letter threatening to sue me for breach of contract, claiming I was the one who had breached by trespassing on HOA property and harassing her members. She also threatened to report me to various government agencies for so-called fraudulent land claims and tax evasion. My lawyer responded with a comprehensive letter documenting every violation of Article 2, Section 2 with dates and supporting evidence. He also noted that filing false reports with government agencies could constitute malicious prosecution, which is actionable under Philippine law. The HOA board, apparently realizing that Karen had dragged them into serious trouble, called an emergency meeting. I wasn't there obviously, but I heard about it afterward from Mang Tony, the former HOA president who had tried to explain who I was at that very first meeting. According to him, several board members confronted Karen about her handling of the landowner situation and demanded to know why she had repeatedly antagonized someone who was essentially giving them free use of his property. Karen apparently tried to defend herself by saying I was difficult and unreasonable and that she was simply protecting the community's interests. But when the board members saw the documentation of everything she had done, including the police incident, the forensic signature demand, they were not sympathetic. The board voted to send me a formal letter of apology and asked whether I would reconsider the termination. The letter was actually well written and took responsibility for the so-called miscommunication and misunderstandings that had occurred. It also noted that the board had accepted the resignation of HOA President Karen, effective immediately. Karen was out, and I considered accepting the apology and withdrawing the termination. The pool was nice, after all, and I didn't really have other plans for the property. But then I thought about Karen's son calling me mentally ill in front of everyone. I thought about the months of harassment and the hostile stares from residents who were too afraid to stand up to her. And I realized that, even with Karen gone, I would never feel at ease going there again. I told them the termination would stand. The 90 days were chaotic for the subdivision. The HOA had to figure out what to do with all the facilities. They couldn't move the pool, obviously, but they removed all the furniture, the playground equipment, and everything from the clubhouse. They also had to inform all the residents that the recreational facilities would be shutting down. I heard through Mang Tony that many residents were furious at Karen for causing this mess. Several families had specifically chosen to buy into that subdivision because of the pool and recreational facilities, and now those amenities were disappearing because Karen couldn't stop herself from antagonizing the one person who had the power to take them away. After the 90 days ended, I hired a contractor to fill in the pool and demolish the clubhouse. It cost me some money, but I didn't want to deal with the liability of an empty pool and abandoned structures on my property. I planted some trees and essentially returned it to an empty lot. A few months later, a developer approached me about purchasing the property, with the subdivision now fully built out around it. The lot was actually worth significantly more than it had been when I first leased it to the HOA. I remember my grandpa's advice about never selling land, but I also figured he would have made an exception for a price this good. I sold it for enough to pay off my house and put my kids through college. The developer built a small commercial complex on the lot, a convenience store, and a few other shops serving the subdivision. The residents now pay retail prices for what used to be free amenities, and every time they walk past that convenience store, they can think about Karen and her son. As for Karen, I heard she moved out of the subdivision within a few months of being removed as HOA president. The social situation had apparently become very uncomfortable for her. I don't know where she ended up, and frankly, I don't care. Her son, I assume, is out there making life difficult for some other community. I hope he learned something from all of this, but I'm not holding my breath. So, Reddit, am I the a-hole for terminating the lease and taking away the HOA's pool because Karen and her son wouldn't stop harassing me? I feel like I was justified, but I know that plenty of innocent people got caught in the crossfire. Let me know in the comments what you think. Was Opie in the wrong here or not? I'm genuinely curious about your take. Comment number 1 said, "You're the a-hole, and I cannot believe people are actually defending this." Okay, so let me get this straight. You had a lease agreement that was generating passive income. The community was benefiting. Everyone was happy for years, and then one person caused problems, so you decided to blow the whole thing up. You didn't just punish Karen. Karen moved away and is probably doing fine. You punished dozens of families who had absolutely nothing to do with any of this. Kids who used that pool for birthday parties, elderly folks who did their morning exercises there, families who purchased their homes specifically because of those amenities. And for what? Because a teenager was mean to you. Seriously, you're in your 30s. Why are you letting a 16-year-old get to you like that? He called you mentally ill, and your response was to destroy a community resource worth hundreds of thousands of pesos. That's not justice. That's a tantrum. The worst part is you acknowledge that innocent people got hurt. You literally say in your post, but you went ahead and did it anyway because your feelings were wounded. That is not justice. That is revenge against people who did nothing to you. You are massively the a-hole. Comment number 2, NTA full stop. I see people in the comments saying you should have accepted the apology once Karen was removed, and I completely disagree. Here's why. First, the harassment went on for months. This wasn't just a single misunderstanding that got cleared up. Karen systematically tried to deny you access to your own property, called the cops on you, accused you of fraud, demanded forensic analysis of signatures, and spread rumors that you were a scammer. That is not miscommunication. That is a coordinated effort to strip you of your legal rights. Second, the board allowed it to happen. Where were these reasonable board members when Karen was sending you threatening letters? Where were they when she called the police? Where were they when residents started giving you hostile looks? They only stepped up once you terminated the lease and they realized they were about to lose their pool. That's not accountability, that's damage control. Third, and this is the big one, you were doing them an enormous favor and they repaid you with abuse. You provided your land at essentially no cost for a decade. The market rate for that lease would have been substantial. You were essentially subsidizing their lifestyle, and in return, a teenager publicly called you mentally ill while his mother tried to have you arrested on your own property. You don't owe anyone your generosity. That's precisely what makes it generosity. The moment they started treating you like an intruder instead of a benefactor, they forfeited any moral claim to your goodwill. People saying you punished innocent people are missing the point entirely. You didn't punish anyone. You simply stopped doing them a favor. There's a real difference. You're not obligated to provide a community pool to people who stand silently by while you're being harassed. And yeah, I think I'd agree with that. OP was clearly way too generous to this HOA community, and as a result, they took advantage of his kindness. Though honestly, if I were in OP's position, I'm not sure I'd have filled in that pool. I probably would have found a way to keep using it for myself or something. And the next one is a malicious compliance story titled, "Tell me to shut up and do as I'm told." Okay, this happened a few years ago, but it still makes me laugh. So, I used to work at a family-owned restaurant in a tourist town. The staff was decent enough, but the whole we're a family mentality should have been my first red flag. Starting out, we had a 40-something male manager who had worked there since it opened about 13 years ago. When I first started, Mike was an okay guy, a bit uptight and not really one for small talk, but whatever. His assistant manager, Kelsey, however, was a real piece of work. She had worked there for 9 years, took at least 10 smoke breaks per shift while we servers weren't allowed outside more than one at a time and only for a few minutes. She'd stand out there all day and kick us off our breaks whenever she wanted one. One day, I was filling up ketchup bottles. We usually marry them, pouring one into another. All restaurants do this, by the way. It's not a new concept. However, Kelsey spotted me and berated me, stating that it was a health code violation and that I needed to fill small ramekins for to-go orders every single time. Obviously, that was complete nonsense that's been standard practice at chain restaurants for years, bottle to bottle. So I did it. I let it go. The next day, I saw my coworker marrying bottles and mentioned what Kelsey had said to me. Mike overheard and told me I should shut up and do what my manager tells me, even if it's different from what others are doing. So essentially, my coworker could marry bottles, but I had to waste extra time filling tiny ramekins. Bet? So that night, I had my coworkers bring me everything. Ketchup, mustard, mayonnaise, one sauce, barbecue, everything, and I filled an entire metal tub full of sauces. No labels, just 100 plus ramekins of random condiments with a note that read, "Just do as you're told." I quit the next day. I heard later that they found it. Most of it had gone bad, and Mike was absolutely furious but couldn't do a thing about it. Also, side note, my favorite day working there was when Mike threatened to fire Kelsey for taking too long in the bathroom, and she ended up crying outside chain-smoking cigarettes. And yeah, thanks for watching the malicious compliance stories, and I'll see you again next time.